instantly claiming central space and opening diagonals for queen and bishop. A classical response, mirroring white's ambition and opening possibilities for swift central conflict. Developing the knight to f3 immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares to castle, aiming for a swift kingside launch. Developing the knight to c6 offers excellent central control and prepares for pawn expansion. A classic Lopez opening, immediately creating central tension and challenging black's knight's influence. Striking back at the center, this develops a knight and attacks white's pawn. Castling neatly tucks the king away and prepares to swing the rook into action. Boldly seizing central space, this pawn grab immediately creates tactical complications and tests white's developing harmony. Recapturing the pawn with the rook clears the d-file, preparing to challenge black's central pawn majority and control key squares. Retreating the knight to d6 gracefully resolves the immediate knight fork, preparing for potential pawn advances and central influence. Reclaiming the central pawn immediately, white initiates a tactical skirmish that reshapes the pawn structure and opens lines toward black's king. The knight's active repositioning now directly threatens d6, forcing a decision and potentially creating immediate attacking chances if black isn't careful with their king's safety. Bolstering the knight's protection with the bishop creates a solid defensive ring, preparing to contest the e-file and potentially challenge white's central presence. Shifting the bishop to f1 initiates a subtle repositioning, preparing to contest the d-file or potentially reinforce the kingside later without obstructing the g-pawn's advance. This retreat, though seemingly passive, aims to foster greater piece harmony and keep options open for development, a quiet, intelligent maneuver in a complex opening. Opening up the d-file for your queen after absorbing pressure creates immediate counterplay, but be mindful of the centralized knight on d5 potentially becoming a juicy target if your pieces aren't adequately supported. Reclaiming the pawn immediately creates a material advantage and opens the central files, offering white excellent attacking prospects. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, and this immediate castling consolidates black's king onto a much more secure square, steering clear of potential central threats that the open position might otherwise invite. Initiating central expansion with this pawn push forcefully challenges black's piece placement and aims to seize more board real estate for white's pieces, potentially opening lines towards the kingside if black responds passively. The knight retreats, conceding central influence but preparing to reposition for a more active role, perhaps targeting the weakened kingside or reinforcing the d-pawn's advance. Reoccupying the central file, white repositions the rook, aiming to reassert pressure on black's slightly awkward knight placement and potentially exploit the open d-file for further advancement, a cautious but purposeful redeployment of forces. Solidifying the center with this pawn advance addresses black's previously exposed e-pawn and creates a more robust pawn chain, aiming to gain breathing room and potentially launch a queenside initiative while preparing for future pawn breaks. Developing the bishop to d3 solidifies control of the central dark squares, aiming to support a potential kingside advance and prepare for the long-term pressure on black's queenside. Black repositions the bishop, aiming to activate it and potentially challenge white's central influence, though it might also find itself a bit cramped on this diagonal without immediate pawn support. The knight's journey to d2 signals a repositioning, aiming to solidify the center and prepare for future pawn advances, potentially d5, after establishing better coordination. Reclaiming the kingside outpost, this knight strategically repositions to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for potential kingside action. An attempt to recapture the initiative on the kingside, but it might overextend the knight's reach and expose it to counterplay, potentially leading to awkward maneuvering later. Bringing the bishop to g4 aims to exchange it for white's knight, subtly simplifying the position while creating an open diagonal for black's queen, and potentially pressuring white's kingside pawn structure if white recaptures with the f-pawn later on. White sharpens the central struggle by pinning the knight, initiating a battle for control of key squares and potentially forcing a structural concession from black. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to expand on the queenside is the core idea behind this move, aiming to create a more dynamic structure for black's pieces. Building a solid central pawn chain is the immediate priority, securing the d4 pawn and preventing black's intended bishop development to g4, which would disrupt white's queenside. Re-establishing the bishop on c7, a classic maneuver in this Lopez structure, allows black to prepare for an eventual queenside expansion and provides crucial support for the d5 pawn, which has become a strategic anchor. This repositioning aims to increase piece harmony and offers the bishop a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing white's kingside down the road once the center is more settled. It's a subtle but important step towards solidifying black's position and avoiding passive play. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal aims to increase pressure on the kingside, potentially preparing a future kingside attack by opening lines for the queen and rook. Shifting the queen to d6 is an interesting redirection, aiming to support a potential pawn push to d5 and clear the path for the rook to potentially swing over to the kingside later, though it does leave the f6 knight somewhat isolated. Reshaping the kingside attack, the bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, creating immediate pressure on the knight that guards the d5 pawn and eyeing potential targets on the queenside. Shifting the queen to the d-file aims to bolster central influence and prepare for potential pawn breaks, though it does relinquish some active placement on the queenside where it might have contested white's more advanced pieces. Bolstering the bishop's diagonal presence, this move aims to reposition the piece for greater influence, potentially targeting black's kingside or creating new attacking avenues. Reclaiming the central files with the rook on e8 is a strategic pivot, aiming to reintegrate this piece into the battlefield and potentially challenge white's control over the open e-file after white's last bishop maneuver. This repositioning prepares for future pawn advances or potential piece exchanges, offering black a chance to untangle their forces and create more dynamic counterplay, a crucial step in alleviating the slight positional bind black has been under. Unraveling the pawn structure by force, this capture immediately opens lines and seeks to exploit any lingering weaknesses around the enemy monarch, aiming to disrupt black's cozy development and potentially expose their king to further scrutiny. Opening the g-file creates immediate attacking possibilities, but the doubled pawns significantly weaken your king's pawn shield, a trade-off demanding careful calculation to defend against white's central control and potential pawn storm. The rook's journey across the board culminates in clearing the 7th rank, initiating a potential pawn storm that now appears less threatening for black's king. The rook finally finds a home on the open file, but the pawn structure's fragmentation now presents a lasting weakness that will demand meticulous defense. Reclaiming the bishop's diagonal, this repositioning aims to challenge the opponent's kingside pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack, a subtle shift towards creating opportunities where none seemed to exist moments ago. Black aims to centralize the queen, fostering potential support for pawn advances on the kingside or a regrouping for the d-file. Positioning the queen on d3 aims to increase pressure along the central files and prepares for potential pawn pushes or piece redeployments, seeking to exploit black's slightly passive structure after the pawn exchanges. Grasping for pawn structure solidity, black shores up the kingside but concedes central influence and opens a diagonal for white's bishop. Developing the kingside pawn structure to support the bishop and create defensive potential. Embracing the doubled pawns, black shifts the queen to a more active outpost, aiming to exploit the light-squared weaknesses and potentially pressure white's king. Launching a knight forward with this maneuver aims to seize control of the critical kingside squares, potentially preparing for a swift assault on black's vulnerable monarch, while also offering a flexible retreat should the situation demand it. Launching a pawn assault on the king's flank, black desperately seeks to rip open lines with the f-pawn, creating chaos and potential attacking avenues against white's potentially exposed monarch. This aggressive thrust prioritizes immediate activity, hoping to disrupt white's developing harmony and exploit any lingering weaknesses in their kingside structure. Relocating the knight to g2 intends to either reinforce the kingside defense or prepare a potential kingside attack, depending on how black responds to the positional pressure being built. The rook's repositioning to the 6th rank immediately exerts pressure, challenging the defender's precarious pawn structure and opening pathways for potential breakthroughs. Reorganizing the bishop to a more active diagonal after black's pawn advance strengthens white's central influence and prepares for potential kingside play. Reclaiming the bishop's active diagonal after a period of repositioning offers a tangible improvement in the piece's scope, immediately challenging the central pawn structure and potentially creating tactical threats against the kingside. Reinforcing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal and preparing to activate the queen on the kingside offers a subtle positional upgrade, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's monarch after the pawn structure shifts. This repositioning of the queen to g6 seeks to redeploy the monarch's primary attacker, aiming to pressure the weakened kingside and potentially disrupt white's coordination by creating a new target. Clearing the center with this exchange simplifies the position, offering white a path towards an endgame where their slightly more active pieces might pose problems, though black's kingside pawn structure remains robust. Embracing the doubled pawn and the open g-file is a bold statement. It's about actively disrupting white's central control and aiming for a counterplay built on initiative, even at the cost of structural integrity. Opening the central file for the rook grants it increased influence, aiming to pressure the doubled pawns and exploit the exposed king. Relocating the monarch to a more active square offers a crucial outpost and anticipates potential pawn advances by white, while simultaneously preparing for a more flexible pawn structure in the ensuing endgame. Realigning the rook to the 2nd rank now prepares for potential pressure along the open files and offers greater flexibility in coordinating the rooks, potentially eyeing the weak pawn structure that has emerged on black's kingside following the pawn exchanges. Embracing the chaos, black seeks to break the stalemate and create dynamic counterplay by pushing the g-pawn. This audacious advance aims to disrupt white's comfortable pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's remaining pieces, even at the cost of further weakening the kingside. Exchanging rooks here liberates the white king from any lurking back-rank threats and simplifies into an endgame where the knight is a more active piece than the doubled pawns. The rook's departure from the back rank unleashes the black king into a precarious central position, transforming a previously solid defensive structure into a potential target for white's remaining pieces. Pivoting the bishop to the edge of the board may seem passive, but it serves a dual purpose, preventing the black king from finding solace on the g-file and preparing for a potential knight maneuver, perhaps to f2 or g4, to support an advance of the g-pawn or even to pressure black's weakened kingside pawn structure. Embracing the open file and actively engaging the queen's bishop, this maneuver redirects the bishop to a more influential diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's already compromised pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. Pushing the g-pawn now, a bold attempt to create a protected passed pawn, but it risks creating further weaknesses around your monarch and could open lines for black's pieces to infiltrate. The bishop seeks refuge on b1, aiming to escape the immediate pressure on the kingside and potentially find a more active diagonal, though its current placement seems passive. Securing the queenside pawn structure against potential infiltration by black's bishop is the primary objective here, aiming to maintain positional stability. Asserting greater influence on the queenside's open avenues, black mobilizes their remaining minor piece, preparing to engage in a strategic dance for territorial dominance. Sharpening the pawn chain by pushing f3 aims to create a more robust central structure, preventing the black bishop from further infiltration and solidifying white's pawn majority on the kingside, though it does leave a slight weakness on e3 for later exploitation. Unlocking the c-file could be the key to disrupting white's currently solid pawn structure and creating new avenues for counterplay. Navigating the fractured pawn structure, the knight repositions itself towards the kingside, seeking to bolster the defense of the exposed king and potentially participate in future pawn advances. Challenging the central pawn structure is a bold attempt to inject life into this rather static position, but it opens up a diagonal for white's bishop and potentially strengthens white's central control if the advance is met aggressively. Reclaiming the center with this pawn, advance asserts control over crucial squares and prepares for potential pawn breaks later in the game. Unlocking the queenside blockade presents a strategic gambit. Black eyes the open files, aiming to generate counterplay against white's isolated pawn structure, even at the cost of temporarily sacrificing pawn mass for dynamic potential and greater activity. Activating the bishop to the active c2 square prepares to potentially double rooks on the now open c-file, a crucial step in challenging black's somewhat passive pawn structure and creating future threats along the queenside. Reclaiming the diagonal for the bishop, this maneuver aims to control crucial squares on the queenside while preparing for a potential repositioning to a more active outpost, offering a dynamic alternative to passive defense. Capturing that bishop on h7 unlocks a powerful, albeit risky, initiative. White is essentially gambling on their remaining pieces to exploit the now exposed black king and the open g-file, hoping to force a quick checkmate before black can consolidate their material advantage and positional pressure. The bishop's retreat to b6 surrenders the crucial central pawn majority and sacrifices tempo, allowing white to solidify their king's safety and prepare a decisive pawn push. Unlocking the b-file for potential infiltration and pressuring black's isolated d, pawn now becomes a key objective with this knight repositioning. Initiating pawn expansion on the queenside to challenge white's restricted space and potentially create counterplay. The monarch voluntarily leaves the fortress of pawns, seeking open spaces and aiming to become an active participant in the ensuing exchanges. This maneuver signals a bold transition towards a more dynamic king's role in the simplified material environment, potentially aiming to support past pawn advancement or actively participate in pawn battles. The black bishop suddenly flashes to the center, directly challenging the king's immediate vicinity and forcing a decision about its safety, while simultaneously threatening to liberate the pawn's advance. The monarch steps onto a more secure square, shedding its earlier exposure to that nagging diagonal attack. Grasping for breathing room on the queenside, black aims to pry open lines with this pawn thrust, potentially creating an outpost for the bishop on a previously impassable square. Opening the file now provides an immediate avenue for the rook to potentially infiltrate black's weakened queenside pawn structure, creating dynamic attacking chances. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential, this maneuver aims to exploit the exposed white king and create a decisive breakthrough on the queenside. Shifting the monarch towards the center acknowledges the pawn structure's open nature and prepares to escort the passed b-pawn, aiming to create a dangerous threat on the queenside while simultaneously reinforcing the defense against black's potential pawn advances. Seizing the initiative to connect the passed pawn with the king's defense, this maneuver seeks to unravel white's pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay before white's rook can solidify its position. Focusing on the bishop's active placement, white seeks to exploit its diagonal influence, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create attacking opportunities down the open b-file. Sacrificing material for central pawn control is a bold gambit, aiming to dismantle white's queenside structure and open lines for black's remaining pieces. Unleashing the knight from its reserve position, white injects new life into the position, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses created by black's pawn structure and potentially launch an offensive on the kingside or center. The knight finally finds a safe haven, but the bishop's excursion has completely drained white's queenside majority of its potential, leaving it vulnerable to being outmaneuvered. Seizing the initiative, the white king ventures into the heart of the board, a bold maneuver to activate its influence and contest the central squares now that the pawn structure has been dramatically altered. A desperate attempt to cling to material, sacrificing pawn structure for a temporary pawn capture, hoping to create complications where none realistically exist. A desperate attempt to activate the bishop before the king is fully exposed. The black king, now exposed, becomes a magnet for white's remaining forces, setting the stage for a decisive rook hunt. The bishop emerges, scanning the board for potential targets and offering defensive support to its rook, setting up a dynamic phase where pawn structure becomes paramount. Unleashing the king's mobility is the order of the day, as black seeks to activate their monarch and contest the open files, aiming to disrupt white's well-placed bishop. Sensing an opportunity, white endeavors to activate the otherwise passive bishop, hoping to create new attacking avenues on the kingside, or perhaps gain a tempo if black needs to defend. The bishop retreats, a necessary step to avoid the knight's harassment on the kingside, but it sacrifices the potential for more active piece play on the open diagonals. Bishops are now in a static alignment, surrendering initiative and creating potential outposts for black's remaining pieces, especially the knight. The b-pawns march onward, pushing the decisive break in the structure, aims to create a passed pawn and potentially disrupt white's defensive setup. Securing the king's immediate vicinity offers a crucial breathing room, preventing black's knight from further encroaching and solidifying white's central presence, albeit in a passive way for the moment. Embracing the endgame's stark realities, the king boldly ventures forth, seeking activity and threatening to disrupt white's established pawn structure. Seizing the pawn with the king decisively simplifies the position and ventures into a pawn-up endgame, aiming to leverage the material advantage. The black king, now an active participant, marches forward to claim its share of the central squares, disrupting white's pawn structure and threatening immediate confrontation. The king's exposed position after that last check becomes white's most immediate concern, forcing an immediate reaction to shield it from further harassment. The pawn marches forward, aiming to solidify its central presence and perhaps create a passed pawn down the d-file, a potentially decisive advantage in this endgame. Trying to create a bit of breathing room for your king, but it feels like a passive reaction rather than a proactive step to improve your position. Securing the pawn chain's advanced outposts, with the king now, allows for a more dynamic pawn push in the center. The monarch attempts to solidify its position by retreating to a more secure square, aiming to avoid immediate threats and prepare for a potential counterthrust. Unleashing the king into the fray, black seizes the initiative and demands white's immediate attention, aiming to exploit the exposed royal position.